A black woman in a professional military uniform arrived at the airport one morning, ready to board a flight to attend an important military conference. Her uniform was sharp, her posture straight, and she walked with confidence. As she approached the boarding gate, she noticed two officers standing nearby, talking to a couple of other passengers. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and she continued walking toward the counter, where she'd already checked in for her flight. But as soon as she approached the boarding area, things took an unexpected turn. The two officers suddenly blocked her way. One officer looked at her with a certain expression, as though something was bothering him. He asked her to stop. "Excuse me, ma'am, we need to check something," he said, his tone neutral but firm. She wasn't sure why they wanted to stop her, as she had already completed all the security checks and had no issues at the gate so far. "Is there a problem?" she asked, looking at both officers in confusion. She hadn't done anything wrong, and her flight was already ready to board. One of the officers glanced at her for a moment, then looked at the other officer, exchanging an unspoken signal. Then he spoke again, his voice a little more direct this time. "Can we see your ID and flight details, please?" "Sure," she replied, reaching into her bag. She handed over the required documents, though she still wasn't sure why they were questioning her. She had always followed airport rules, just like everyone else. However, there was something about the way the officers were looking at her that made her feel uneasy. As she handed them the papers, one of the officers kept eyeing her suspiciously. He glanced down at her uniform with a dismissive look, then back at her. "Are you sure you belong on this flight?" he asked, his words a little more pointed now. She was surprised by the question. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I'm an officer in the military, and I'm attending a conference. My badge is all in order," she explained, trying to stay polite despite the growing sense that something wasn't right. The officers exchanged a look, one of them smirking slightly, while the other looked uncertain. "We just need to make sure," the first officer muttered. She was starting to feel frustrated. Why were they treating her like this? She had been traveling for years, always following the rules. But here she was, questioned in a way that felt like they doubted her right to be at the gate. The seconds stretched on, and her calm demeanor started to feel like the only thing standing between this encounter and a potentially worse situation. The woman remained composed, offering no more than a steady gaze and quiet words. "I'm telling you, I'm supposed to be on this flight. Please check with the airline or my superiors if you need verification." But the officers, instead of simply doing that, continued their silent interrogation. One officer started flipping through the documents, acting as if something wasn't quite adding up. At this point, the woman's patience began to wear thin. It was clear they weren't going to let her go without some sort of confirmation, even though she had provided all the necessary papers. She could feel the frustration mounting, but she kept her cool. She knew better than to make a scene, especially at an airport, where emotions could run high. But inside, she was starting to think, how much longer would this go on before they realized the mistake they were making? The woman stood quietly, watching as the officers continued to go through her documents. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, some looking curiously, others avoiding the scene altogether. The tension in the air was thick, but she kept her posture straight and her composure intact. The officer who had initially asked for her documents began to speak again, his tone more doubtful this time. "We just need to verify some details," he said, his voice slightly colder now. He looked down at the papers again, then back at her with a look of suspicion. "Are you really an officer? You don't exactly look like one." The comment hung in the air, and for a brief moment, she was taken aback. Was this really happening? Was he questioning her appearance rather than her credentials? She felt her stomach twist with frustration, but she refused to let it show. "I'd assure you I am," she replied calmly, keeping her voice steady. "I've been serving for years, and I have all the necessary documentation." She could hear the edge in his voice, and it became clearer to her that this wasn't about paperwork. It was something else. something that had nothing to do with the validity of her ID or her flight. The officer looked her up and down, still not convinced. She could feel his judgment, as if he had already made up his mind about who she was based on her skin color and appearance. His body language said it all. He didn't expect a black woman in a uniform to be where she was. He seemed to think she didn't belong in that space, in that position, as though he couldn't accept the idea that someone like her could hold such authority. She didn't know whether to be angry or disappointed. It was 2024, after all, and here she was, having to deal with this kind of disrespect. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of showing weakness. Instead, she repeated herself, even more firmly this time. I'm a high-ranking officer. I've served in multiple assignments, and I had a long career behind me. The second officer, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. He glanced at his partner, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Maybe we should call someone, he suggested hesitantly. But the first officer, still stubborn, shook his head. No, we'll handle it ourselves. His words were dismissive, and the woman could sense that he didn't want to admit he had made a mistake. The woman remained calm, but her mind was racing. It was clear they were not going to believe her unless something more concrete happened. Her uniform alone wasn't enough for them to respect her authority. She had been trained to remain calm in difficult situations, but this was becoming something else. She wondered, what was it about her? About her being a black woman, that made these officers question her presence? Why wasn't her service and rank enough to prove her worth? Her mind quickly turned to the one thing that could prove beyond a doubt who she was. She took a deep breath and made the decision. It was time to show them who they were dealing with. She reached into her bag and pulled out her badge, the one that not only proved her rank, but also carried the weight of her years of service. She slowly held it out in front of the officers, watching as their eyes fell on the gleaming insignia. Without saying another word, she placed the badge in front of them, letting the officers take in the full impact of what they were seeing. For a moment, everything stood still. The two officers stood frozen for a moment as the woman held her badge out in front of them. The atmosphere around them seemed to change in an instant. The sound of the airport, the distant hum of announcements over the PA system, and the chatter of other passengers all faded into the background. The officers couldn't take their eyes off the badge in her hand. It wasn't just any badge, it was the symbol of her rank, her years of dedication, and the immense responsibility she carried as a senior officer in the military. For a second, neither officer said a word. The first officer's mouth opened slightly, as if he were about to speak but couldn't find the words. He blinked, processing what was in front of him, and then slowly looked up at her, his face turning red with embarrassment. The woman's gaze never wavered. She didn't need to say anything. The badge did all the talking for her. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner before looking back at the woman. His eyes were filled with surprise and something else. Maybe regret. Maybe even shame. It was clear they were now questioning everything that had just happened. The disbelief that had been so evident in their voices only moments earlier was now replaced with quiet shock. The woman could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that they were processing not just the badge, but also their own mistakes. The first officer finally found his voice, though it came out in a weak, stammering tone. I didn't know. I didn't realize you were. He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence. The words felt empty, hollow. How could he possibly explain the judgment that had led him to question her in the first place? How could he justify the assumptions he'd made based on her appearance and the uniform she wore? The woman didn't respond right away. She simply let the silence hang in the air, letting them process the reality of the situation. There was no need for her to say anything harsh. She had nothing to prove. The truth was right there in front of them, staring them in the face. After a few long moments, the second officer cleared his throat, clearly trying to make the situation right. "We're sorry," he said, his voice softer now, lacking the earlier edge. We should have verified things more carefully. But the apology felt almost too little, too late. The damage had been done. She had been treated like a suspect, as if her presence at the airport was somehow a mistake, when in reality, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wasn't angry, but it was hard not to feel disappointed by how quickly they had judged her without considering the facts. The first officer, still trying to recover from his mistake, looked at the woman sheepishly. "We made an assumption, and it was wrong," he admitted. "You should have never been questioned like that." She nodded slowly, her expression calm but firm. "I know," she said quietly, her voice steady. "It's not about making a mistake. It's about how quickly assumptions are made based on appearance. If you had simply checked my ID, you would have seen that there was no issue." The officers exchanged glances, both of them now visibly uncomfortable with how things had played out. The woman could see that they were beginning to understand the gravity of what had happened. But for her, it wasn't enough. She didn't need their apologies. What mattered was that they learned something from this moment. She hoped they would think twice before ever judging someone so quickly again, based on nothing but the way they looked. As the silence stretched on, she gathered her things and prepared to board her flight. The officers stepped aside, now fully aware of their mistake. As she walked past them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. This encounter wasn't just about her. It was a reminder to everyone that assumptions and bias could be harmful, no matter who you were or where you came from. The woman took a slow breath, trying to center herself as she prepared to walk away. The officers, still standing at the gate, watched her every step with a mixture of guilt and discomfort. She had nothing to prove anymore, but as she moved toward the boarding area, she could feel the weight of the situation lingering in the air. She could hear the murmurs of other passengers who had quietly witnessed the exchange. Some looked at her with admiration, while others seemed unsure of what had just happened. The whispers around her made her realize just how much of an impact this moment was having. She was calm, composed, and polite throughout the entire ordeal, but it was hard not to feel the sting of the officers' initial actions. Despite their apologies, the woman knew that this was far from over. The situation had escalated because of their assumptions, and she didn't want it to be brushed aside as if it was just a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't just about the inconvenience she had faced. It was about the fact that she had been treated differently, not because of her qualifications, but because of how she looked. It was the harsh reality that so many people of color faced every day, being judged by appearance rather than merit. As she continued toward the gate, she couldn't help but think of the many others who might have been in her position. People who might not have had the same opportunity to reveal their identity, people who might have been dismissed or even punished without a chance to prove themselves. She felt a quiet responsibility to speak out, to use her position to make sure that this type of thing didn't happen again, not just to her, but to anyone else. She reached the counter where the boarding agent was waiting, and without a word, the agent scanned her ticket. The woman's mind was still racing, but she didn't show it. The agent didn't ask any questions or make any comments. They simply processed the flight and handed her the boarding pass. The interaction was brief, professional, and without incident. As she stepped onto the plane, she noticed the crew members nodding and smiling as she walked past them. It was a subtle acknowledgement, but it gave her a sense of reassurance. This was where she belonged. This was what she had worked so hard for, her place in this world, her hard-earned achievements. Despite the difficult encounter, she felt an inner strength rise within her. She had navigated the situation with grace and dignity, showing that she was more than capable of handling adversity. But even as she settled into her seat, her thoughts lingered on the encounter with the officers. She knew this wasn't something she could just forget. There was a larger issue at play here, something deeper than just one moment at an airport. It was the systemic biases that still lingered in everyday life, the prejudices that affected people's opportunities and how they were treated in spaces where they should be welcomed without hesitation. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, she looked out the window, her thoughts still spinning. It wasn't just about this one experience. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. She felt a quiet determination building within her. This moment was going to be the push she needed to raise awareness, to speak out about what she had experienced, and to bring attention to the ways that biases, often unnoticed by those in power, could shape a person's day and their future. The woman knew that one small interaction might not change the world, but it could plant a seed. And sometimes, all it took was one person to stand up and say, "This isn't right," to start a chain reaction. She was ready to do just that. As the plane descended into the sky, the woman leaned back in her seat, looking out the window as the city below grew smaller. Her mind was still processing everything that had happened at the airport. The discomfort of the officers' initial questioning, the sting of their assumptions, and the way they treated her like an outsider. It was hard to shake off. It wasn't just an inconvenience or a momentary misunderstanding. It was a reminder of the subtle yet persistent biases that still existed in the world. She thought about how quickly they had judged her based on nothing more than her appearance. In that instant, they had reduced her to something less than what she was, someone who didn't belong, someone who couldn't possibly be an officer of any significant rank. Their dismissive attitude wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that people of color, especially black women, faced daily. It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like she had to prove herself, to show that she was worthy of the position she had worked so hard to earn. But it was different this time. This time, they had underestimated her, and it had cost them. Despite the frustration of the experience, she also felt a sense of quiet pride. In that moment, when they questioned her identity, she had remained calm. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't let the situation spiral out of control. Instead, she had shown them who she was, not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet strength. And it had worked. It had been the one thing they couldn't ignore, her badge, her proof of rank, of years of service and commitment. The officers had apologized, but their words didn't feel like enough. Apologies were easy. Real change, real progress, took more than just words. It took action. It took a commitment to see people for who they truly were, to stop making assumptions based on what they looked like or where they came from. The woman knew that things had to change, but that change didn't start with them. It started with people like her, people who had the power to raise their voices and make others listen. She thought about how many times, throughout her career, she had been overlooked or doubted. It wasn't just the officers at the airport. It was the countless moments where her achievements were dismissed, where she had to work harder just to prove that she was capable. It was exhausting, but it was also the reality. And as much as she hated it, she couldn't ignore the fact that it was something she had learned to live with. But now, something was different. Now, she wasn't just brushing it aside. She had the opportunity to make sure that others didn't have to go through the same thing. She could use her position, her voice, to raise awareness about what had happened. She could speak out about how biases, whether intentional or not, shaped the way people saw others. And maybe, just maybe, it would make a difference. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign turned off, she felt a sense of purpose begin to rise within her. She didn't want to be remembered just for her rank or her service, though those things were important. She wanted to be remembered as someone who stood up for what was right, someone who refused to let the unfairness of the world go unnoticed. She thought about the other people who might have been in her position that day, people who didn't have the same platform to speak out, who might have been intimidated or silenced by the same biases that she had faced. She felt a responsibility to them. She had the power to speak up, to tell her story, and to make sure that this incident wasn't swept under the rug. As the plane moved further along its path, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this experience be forgotten. She would speak out, write about it, and push for change wherever she could. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would always be challenges to face. But she knew that her voice mattered, that her story could inspire others to stand up against injustice too. She wasn't just an officer in the military. She was someone who had the strength to make a difference, one small moment at a time. And that thought, more than anything, gave her the confidence to keep moving forward. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the woman's thoughts began to settle. The initial rush of emotions, the frustration, the disbelief, had started to fade, but the experience remained firmly planted in her mind. The officers' actions, their assumptions, and the discomfort she had felt weren't something she could easily forget. She couldn't let it go because it was more than just a bad encounter at an airport. It was about something much larger, a pattern of behavior that she knew existed far beyond this one isolated incident. She looked out the window again, watching the clouds drift by, and wondered how many others had been through something similar. How many people of color, especially black women, had experienced these same kinds of assumptions, only to be brushed off without a second thought. This wasn't just about her. It was about the system, about the unconscious biases that were built into so many aspects of daily life, including places where people should feel safe and respected, like airports or other public spaces. The woman thought back to the years she had spent working her way up in the military. It hadn't been easy. It had taken years of dedication, hard work, and sacrifice to get to where she was. Every rank she had earned came with its own set of challenges, its own hurdles. But this wasn't something she had ever expected to face in her career. She had never imagined that one day, in her uniform, with all the necessary documentation, she would be questioned so thoroughly, treated as though she didn't belong simply because of the color of her skin. The reality hit her harder than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just about individual mistakes. It was a reflection of the deep-seated biases that still lingered in society. She had worked alongside people of all races, genders, and backgrounds, earning the respect of those who saw her for who she truly was. Yet, there were still those who couldn't look past the surface, who couldn't see beyond their own prejudices. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was one that she knew needed to be addressed. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a slow, steady breath. She had learned over the years that she couldn't control other people's actions or thoughts, but she could control how she responded. And she had handled this situation with dignity and grace, even when it had been difficult. She had stayed calm when others might have lost their composure, and in the end, she had shown the officers the truth without needing to say a word. That was a victory in its own right. But that victory, she knew, couldn't be the end of the conversation. She wasn't going to let this moment be just a story to tell. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. She thought about what she could do next. She had the platform, the position, and the voice to bring attention to the problem. She could share her experience, speak out about the biases that were often overlooked or ignored, and push for greater awareness and change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. She understood that. Change took time, and real change came when people were willing to listen, to learn, and to act. But if she could even start the conversation, if she could open someone's eyes to the ways in which bias and assumptions affected how people were treated, then it would be worth it. She didn't want this experience to be forgotten. She didn't want anyone else to feel like they had to fight for their place in the world simply because of who they were or how they looked. The woman's thoughts drifted back to her time in the military, the bonds she had formed with people who respected her for her abilities, her commitment, and her leadership. She realized that while the officers at the airport had made their mistake, they weren't her only experience with authority figures. In fact, there had been many others who had treated her with respect, who had seen her for the leader she was, not the color of her skin. But those moments of respect and understanding weren't always the ones people remembered. It was the moments of doubt, of prejudice, that seemed to stand out the most, especially when they involved people in positions of power. And that's what had to change. People needed to recognize that biases were real and that they affected everyone, not just the ones being judged. As the plane continued its journey, the woman felt a sense of determination build inside her. She knew that no matter what, she wouldn't let her story be dismissed. She had a purpose, a reason to keep pushing forward, to keep speaking up. The road ahead might be challenging, but she was ready to face it. And with every step she took, she would be one step closer to making a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. As the plane continued to soar through the sky, the woman's thoughts became more focused. She had taken some time to reflect on the incident, but now, the questions she had been asking herself were becoming clearer. What did she want to do with this experience? How could she turn something painful into an opportunity for change? She had always believed that every challenge came with a lesson, but today's events were difficult to wrap her mind around. The officer's actions had stung, and they'd left her feeling as though her identity, her rank, and everything she had worked for had been questioned. The assumptions they had made based on her appearance were a harsh reminder of how bias could seep into everyday interactions. But as she thought about the bigger picture, she realized that this moment, though uncomfortable, could be a catalyst for something meaningful. She thought about the countless people who had probably faced similar situations, people who didn't have the same voice or platform to speak up. Her situation was not unique, unfortunately. Many others had been unfairly judged and treated with suspicion simply because of their race, gender, or background. This had been her moment, her chance to stand up and show that prejudice should never define someone's worth or potential. But what about the others? The ones who didn't have a badge to hold up in defense? What about those who didn't have the same power to speak out or to correct people's mistakes? Her mind turned to the idea of amplifying her story, not to seek sympathy, but to encourage understanding. She realized that speaking out wasn't just about defending herself. It was about raising awareness of the biases that so many people faced, even in the most unexpected places. It was about challenging the assumptions that people made, sometimes without even realizing it, and asking others to do better, to be more aware. If this experience could help even one person understand the impact of these biases, then it would be worth it. For her, the path ahead wasn't just about sharing her own experience. It was about changing the narrative. It wasn't enough for her to feel justified in the moment. She wanted to help others see the importance of self-reflection, of examining how assumptions and prejudice shaped their perceptions of others. It was easy for people to make snap judgments based on appearance or first impressions, but those judgments often missed the full picture, the full story of who someone really was. The woman thought back to her time in the military. She had always been surrounded by a diverse group of people, and it was in that environment that she had learned the true value of respect, trust, and equality. In the military, her team depended on her just as much as she depended on them. They didn't care about her skin color or the way she looked. They cared about her skills, her work ethic, and her commitment to the mission. That's how it should be in every other part of life, too. People should be judged by their abilities, not their appearance. But far too often, that wasn't the case. She recalled a moment from early in her career when she had faced similar skepticism from others. Back then, she had doubted herself. She had questioned whether she could ever prove herself in an environment that seemed so determined to overlook her. But over time, her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Her dedication to her work, her leadership, and her willingness to push through difficult challenges had earned her the respect of those around her. She had earned her place, and no one could take that away. Now, in the wake of the airport incident, she realized that the journey was far from over. There was still work to do, still lessons to teach, still barriers to break down. She didn't want to stop at just sharing her story. She wanted to inspire others to speak up too, to challenge assumptions when they saw them, and to stand firm in their belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. As the plane began its descent toward its destination, the woman felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. She wasn't going to let this experience be just another chapter in her life. She was going to use it as a platform for change. She was going to use her voice, her story, and her platform to inspire others to rethink their own biases and assumptions. She had the power to make a difference, and in that moment, she was more determined than ever to use it. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something even bigger. And with each step she took forward, she knew she would continue to challenge the stereotypes that tried to hold people back, and in doing so, inspire others to do the same. As the woman stepped off the plane, she felt a sense of determination growing inside her. The past few hours had been filled with emotions, reflection, and self-realization, but now that she had arrived at her destination, her focus had shifted. She was ready to face what came next. The experience at the airport, while unsettling and frustrating, had given her a new perspective. It was a reminder that the work was far from finished, and there were still important conversations to be had. As she walked through the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the diversity around her. People of all different backgrounds, cultures, and walks of life moved about, each with their own story. It was a reminder that the world was a much more complex place than it might seem on the surface. And in that complexity, there were still many who struggled with biases and assumptions, just as she had faced. But she wasn't alone. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that everyone had their own battles, their own challenges that they were working through. It was that thought that sparked something inside her. She couldn't keep this experience to herself. She had to speak up, not just for herself, but for those who had faced similar situations without the opportunity to challenge the assumptions made about them. She had the privilege of being able to address what had happened at the airport, but others didn't. She had the opportunity to be heard, to share her voice and her story, and she realized that she couldn't waste that chance. Her mind wandered back to the time she had spent working her way up in her career. She thought about the moments when she had been underestimated, when people had questioned her abilities simply because of the way she looked. It had never been easy, but it had taught her to push forward, to prove herself with her actions, and to never let anyone define her worth. But it wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about making sure that others didn't have to fight the same battle, that they didn't have to struggle in silence because of the way they were perceived. She decided that the next step was clear. She was going to share her experience. She was going to make sure that people understood the impact of their actions, how easily bias could shape how someone was treated, whether consciously or unconsciously. It wasn't about pointing fingers or blaming anyone. It was about raising awareness, starting a conversation, and helping others understand how to do better. She began to plan how she would share her story. She thought about writing about it, sharing the details, but also reflecting on what it meant for her, and why it was important for others to recognize their own biases. She could write articles, speak at events, and use her voice to make an impact. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her platform wasn't just for her own success or accomplishments. It was for the people who needed someone to speak on their behalf, who needed someone to advocate for change. As the woman left the airport and made her way to her destination, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew that her experience at the airport wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem, one that affected countless others in ways big and small. And it was something that needed to change. Her story was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a start. She could use it to spark meaningful discussions and encourage others to examine their own biases, their own assumptions. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and a collective willingness to listen and learn. But she was ready for that. She wasn't going to give up or let this moment pass without doing something about it. As she walked forward, she felt stronger, more determined than ever. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a world where people weren't judged by the color of their skin, the way they looked, or any other factor beyond their character and abilities. With each step she took, she felt more confident in her ability to make a difference. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. And she knew that, no matter what, she would continue to fight for a world where everyone was seen for who they truly were, not just for what others assumed about them. The woman's journey didn't stop when she left the airport. In fact, it felt like a new chapter had just begun. What had happened earlier was only a glimpse into the deeper issues that many people faced every day. She knew this wasn't just about a single encounter with biased officers. It was part of something bigger, a pattern of judgment and discrimination that many people lived with in silence. As the days went by, she couldn't stop thinking about the moment when the officers had questioned her. It had stung in a way she hadn't expected, but it had also lit a fire inside her. She wasn't just angry. She was motivated to do something about it. She had always believed that change came from within, and now she knew that she had the chance to be part of that change, not just for herself, but for others who didn't have the same platform to speak out. She started by talking to friends and colleagues. She shared what had happened, how the situation had unfolded, and how it made her feel. And as she spoke, she realized something. So many of them had their own stories to tell. They, too, had faced situations where they had been underestimated, judged, or treated unfairly based on how they looked or where they came from. She wasn't alone in this struggle, and that realization only strengthened her resolve. She also reached out to organizations that focused on fighting bias and promoting equality. She wanted to learn more about how she could use her experience to help others. She wanted to understand how to bring about real change, not just in her own life, but in society as a whole. She attended workshops, read articles, and had discussions with people who had dedicated their lives to fighting for equality. With every conversation, her understanding deepened, and she began to see the many ways in which bias affected the world around her. In her daily life, she began to be more vocal about the importance of recognizing bias, even in small moments. She spoke with colleagues, family members, and even strangers about how easily assumptions could be made, often without even realizing it. She wanted people to understand that these biases were harmful, not just because of how they affected individuals, but because they prevented people from reaching their full potential. But she didn't stop there. She realized that to make real change, she needed to use the platforms she had, whether that meant writing articles, giving talks, or simply having conversations with people in positions of power. It wasn't enough to just speak about the issue. She had to push for action. She needed to encourage people to confront their biases, to question why they made certain assumptions, and to take steps toward becoming more inclusive and accepting of others. She began to use her social media accounts to share her story and the lessons she had learned. She spoke about the importance of empathy, of listening to others without judgment, and of recognizing the humanity in everyone, no matter their background. She wanted people to understand that bias didn't just hurt individuals. It hurt entire communities, and it kept society from growing in the ways it needed to. It wasn't always easy. There were times when people disagreed, when they didn't understand the importance of what she was saying. But she didn't back down. She knew that change was never easy, and it was often met with resistance. But she also knew that without speaking out, nothing would change. Over time, her efforts began to pay off. She received messages from people who had been inspired by her story, who had started to look at their own behavior and question their own biases. Some even shared their own experiences, thanking her for helping them feel seen, heard, and understood. It was in those moments that she realized how much power there was in speaking the truth, in sharing a story that was raw and real, even when it was uncomfortable. She had started out thinking she was just one person, facing a single incident. But as her story spread, she began to see the ripple effect it had on others. She wasn't just challenging the assumptions of a few people in an airport. She was sparking a larger conversation. The work wasn't over, but with every conversation, every small victory, she knew she was moving in the right direction. Looking back, the woman realized that her experience wasn't just a setback, it was a stepping stone. It had given her the opportunity to stand up, to speak out, and to inspire others to do the same. And though the road ahead might still be filled with challenges, she knew that with each step, she was closer to creating a world where everyone was seen for who they truly were, not by the assumptions of others.